All right, dopamine deficit, new norm. So now that we have so many things that increase our dopamine, what does that do? These instant gratification ways of increasing our dopamine lead to less natural dopamine, lead to needing more of these artificial ways to spike dopamine. So according to Dr. Anna Lemke, the author of Dopamine Nation, and also according to really compelling research in the world right now, over the past 20 years, all the wealthiest, the richest countries have the lowest happiness rates, the highest addiction rates. So it's the plenty paradox. When we have all these resources, all this food and easy instant gratification, pleasure, alcohol, technology, drugs for some people, so close by. And as a result, people are less happy than if they didn't have any technology or alcohol, like the Aboriginals, for example. So the new normal for a lot of people is a dopamine deficient state as their normal baseline for their nervous system now in life. That's their new baseline, is dopamine deficient. That means things that normally would make us feel pleasure, like a stroll in the park or like a good conversation on the phone or something small, before in a non-dopamine deficient state, those kind of things can do the trick, right? It's like, yeah, I feel pleasure. In a dopamine deficient state, it takes like alcohol or sex or gambling or marijuana or some type of strong dopamine activator, chocolate, sex, methamphetamine, something like that. So the person can feel some sort of pleasure, so they're not, depressed or bored or at the worst, anhedonic, pleasure deaf.
Can you give me the definition of anhedonic?
Inability to feel happiness. I call it pleasure deafness. So deaf people cannot hear, anhedonic people cannot feel pleasure. Here's why this is a touchy subject, and here's why this is an effed up subject too. This is an effed up topic. Since pleasure has attached to it stigma, hedonists, since that, well, nowadays, I don't think it's having, the stigma's going down with the societal global moral degradation that seems to be happening. But back in the 50s, and certainly even 5 years ago, there was more of a stigma toward pleasure. But so we have a sixth sense that's a physical sense, but nobody talks about it. Dr. Kevin McCauley, however, talks about it. He's a former opioid addict that was also he was a doctor, I think, for the Air Force, and he got in an accident and he got injured, and then he was prescribed, I think, Dilaudid or some shit. They had him on some really strong things for quite a while, and then his body got hooked, and then his mind got hooked. And then so they caught him, they busted him doing some shady shit I think he was somehow writing himself prescriptions or getting around it somehow. And then he went to Leavenworth. He got to go stay there for, I think it was a year or maybe 6 months in Leavenworth, or whatever it's called, the prison for the military. Anyways, he studied the whole time that he was in this prison, wanting to understand addiction. He couldn't believe how much that shit hijacked took him totally out of control. To go to med school and to become a doctor and to become, I think he might have been a surgeon even. I could be wrong. Definitely he was in the military doctor. Might have even been a surgeon. So the dude's obviously smart, obviously had tremendous discipline and ability to, implement that discipline and intelligence over the massive, massive long term to get through 4 years of undergrad and then to get through med school and then to get through, the internship for all that time. So as a relatively young doctor, to blow it all like that, or at least, blow it pretty good, not for the rest of his life he didn't blow it, but, really blew it and had to suffer some pretty tremendous consequences. So he couldn't understand how a person like him, how this could happen, right? Yeah, what he found was that addiction, if you wanted to, you could totally technically classify it as a disease, because all that something needs to be classified correctly as a disease is it has to affect an organ and there have to be symptoms, okay? Well, addiction affects the brain, and the symptoms are the, dysphoria, and there are also things like lying, cheating, stealing. That's not with all people's addictions, but so technically it, in extreme cases or even, moderate cases, it can hijack the dopaminergic system. So it shuts down the pleasure system. So we have the sense of touch, the sense of taste and smell and sight and hearing. We also have the sense of pleasure. We have a natural pleasure set point that's based primarily on our genetics, but we all have a natural pleasure set point, and drugs totally hijack that. He argues that it affects the brain. The reason a lot of people think it's a choice is because they're not realizing that it shuts down the sense of pleasure. Okay, so what? So it shuts down your sense of pleasure. Since there's a stigma that pleasure, you're just out there pleasure, but we have to have, so here's the really critical part. Okay, so we have a sense of pleasure, and we all have a natural pleasure set point, and alcohol and other drugs with repeated exposure make our new pleasure set point a lot higher. That means that things that are like a walk in the park or like a delicious juicy apple or things that used to give us a dopamine high, once it gets reset to this higher baseline, now those things don't do it. Okay, so when a person cannot feel any pleasure whatsoever, when they're completely anhedonic, like somebody quitting, a severe addiction for the first couple of weeks, usually a lot of the time, they'll be anhedonic. So what if a person can't feel any pleasure whatsoever? There's no point in even living at that. So just because there's also the hedonism stigma associated with pleasure, certainly with too much pleasure, that doesn't mean that it's not a sense, and that when this sense is completely shut down, we have no ability whatsoever to feel pleasure. Well, then there's no point in living. If you had to go the rest of your life on earth in this human brain and body with inability to feel any pleasure at all, you are guaranteed to go through life completely anhedonic, completely shut off from feeling even the slightest, not happiness, not joy, even the slightest pleasure, period. So that is a huge reason people continue to go back to alcohol, is they are dopamine deficient, and alcohol can give them that dopamine, that feeling of being alive and motivated and interested in a lot of different things and interested in other people, and like you have more energy and your brain's working better and you're confident and you're in the present moment and you're euphoric and your dopamine's sky high, and it brings with it all those other neurotransmitters in pretty good amounts too. So it's this neurotransmitter cocktail that's also synergistic, that's also combined, that's baked in with a blood sugar super spike that's baked in naturally to the neurotransmitter synergistic spike.